drift northwards across East Anglia and the southeast. So potential for some quite heavy rain during this evening, but it does all tend to scoot away and most places again become dry through the early hours. Temperatures holding up in double figures in most towns and cities. And again, Wednesday will by and large be a fine day. There will again be a bit of mist here and there early on, and there will be a few showers to come in, particularly parts of western Scotland. But a brighter day for Northern Ireland and West Wales. Again, quite breezy, but generally another fine warm day. Perhaps not quite as warm as today, but we should still get temperatures quite widely over 20 Celsius across England and Wales, and a warmer day for Northern Ireland, as I mentioned, probably 24, 25 the peak. However, further south, again, the potential for some thunderstorms through Wednesday evening. Some heavy downpours are possible across parts of England. We'll be keeping a close eye on that.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debate, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. This morning, is a trade war with the EU inevitable? Has the Bank of England failed us? And is it right for the politicians to hit out at the bank, which has been politically independent since 1997? And finally, should we move the House of Lords to the north? All that to come after your morning headlines.
A very good morning. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. In Ukraine, more than 260 servicemen have been evacuated from the Azovstal steelworks plant in Mariupol. Ukraine's Deputy Defence Minister says 53 of those evacuated are injured and have been taken to hospital in a Russian-controlled town. All evacuees from the besieged port city will be subject to an exchange. It's not been confirmed how many troops remain in the city. The Foreign Secretary is expected to set out plans to rewrite Britain's post-Brexit trading agreement, changing the rules on how goods enter Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. Well, Liz Truss is expected to announce new legislation in the Commons later, a day after Boris Johnson met with political parties in Belfast. The country's Unionist Party is currently refusing to enter a power-sharing agreement at Stormont unless the existing Northern Ireland Protocol is scrapped. The rate of unemployment dropped to 3.7% in the 3 months to March. It's now at its lowest for almost 50 years. That's according to the Office for National Statistics. That means the number of people in employment rose to just under 30 million. However, figures also showed that in the 3 months to February, wages have decreased. They were 2% lower. That's the steepest decline in nearly a decade. Prince Edward is going to board a train at Paddington Station today, marking the completion of London's Crossrail project. He'll be the first ticket holder for the new Elizabeth line and will head to Tottenham Court Road Station before coming back again. The public can make the same trip when the line opens in a week's time. We're on your TV, online and DAB+ radio. This is GB News. Now let's head to Tom for this morning's briefing.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, yesterday, Boris Johnson flew to Northern Ireland for crisis talks in a bid to find solutions to the Northern Ireland Protocol, which has, of course, lost the consent of the unionist community there. The risk, however, is that unilateral action may spark retaliation from the EU, threatening the whole UK with trade restrictions at a time of cost of living crisis. Well, today, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is expected to announce to Parliament plans for legislation that could see the UK act unilaterally to amend the protocol. Well, joining me now to discuss all of this is Amanda Ferguson, a journalist from Northern Ireland. Welcome to the programme. I suppose when we're looking at how the Prime Minister met with the leaders of those 5 parties at Stormont yesterday, he didn't get the warmest of receptions.
No, he didn't. And some of the parties said that they weren't really clear what the purpose of the meetings was. I think that the Prime Minister probably enjoyed himself most on the tour of the Thales factory, looking at the different weaponry that's made in Belfast. But I think that what you have said in your opening remarks is key, in that it's the plan for the legislation and not actually the legislation. So there's going to be no breakthrough on restoring government, because the DUP is really digging its heels in and it's not going to budge if there isn't action on the protocol as it sees it, rather than words.
Yes, it's interesting listening to the DUP because, of course, they feel like they have been scorned before by this Prime Minister, that potentially he hasn't lived up to his promises to their fullest extent. At what point will the DUP see action? At what point will they think that something has been done enough to come back to that table to re-establish that executive in Northern Ireland?
I think that whenever they see, as they view it, Northern Ireland's place in the UK's internal market being restored, which is a big ask, given that, you know, we know that Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, but it does hold a unique position across these islands. And there was always going to be a unique set of circumstances for this part of the UK because of that sort of invisible land border with the Republic of Ireland, with an EU member state. So, you know, I'm not particularly optimistic about the restoration of Stormont happening anytime soon, but it should be pointed out that while the largest party of unionism, the DUP, doesn't want to return to Stormont immediately, and that it's using the leverage it has there to try to force the government to take action, the smaller Ulster Unionist Party has indicated that it will be happy with a parallel process where devolved government is delivered to deal with all those day-to-day issues that are exercised in the public, while the EU and the UK resolve the protocol issues. And you're right in what you say about there being widespread opposition to the protocol from unionist political leaders, but it shouldn't be categorised as something that all unionists are objecting to. Indeed, some unionists are benefiting from the having the dual market access that the protocol would bring. So it's a complex picture, as Northern Ireland stories always are.
This conversation can so often feel like Groundhog Day. We've been having these discussions almost since 2017, really, when those first parts of the Brexit deal were signed up to by Theresa May, establishing that sequencing of those negotiations. Clearly, the move today in Parliament is about trying to get the EU to get back to the table and to move on in negotiations and to sort of lay almost a threat out there that if the European Union do not negotiate seriously on easing this protocol, the UK will take unilateral action. Does that kind of strongman negotiation tactic work?
Not necessarily. We know that some of the proposals that are on the table, perhaps the introduction of green lanes or red lanes for goods that are moving from Britain to Northern Ireland and staying within Northern Ireland, have been on the table for quite a while. It's how you get that to work practically is where the issues need to be ironed out. But I think what the EU Commission, the Irish government spokespeople have said throughout this is that it's a negotiated position that would be the favoured outcome, that the EU couldn't ignore the UK taking unilateral action. It couldn't ignore a breach of international law. And I suppose the UK has to consider what it would mean for the United Kingdom's reputation internationally if it does take unilateral action, and also what it might mean for a UK-US trade deal, given that politicians across the political spectrum in the US are very keen to protect the Good Friday Agreement and don't want anything that would damage it in any way. So it's a difficult position for the UK government to be in, but certainly whenever you're talking to the Irish government sources or EU sources, they're very clear that a negotiated outcome is their preferred option. But I suppose with the war in Ukraine, the focus hasn't been on Northern Ireland, understandably, and perhaps maybe a more accelerated process and ironing out all of the difficulties with the protocol could be the best way forward. Because while there is unionist political opposition to the protocol, the majority of the MLAs at Stormont, or the newly elected MLAs at Stormont, want an immediate restoration of the Stormont institutions, and they also want to protect the protocol but agree to finesse it and make it more practical for businesses to use.
Well, I suppose we'll have to listen very intently to Liz Truss, who's speaking in Parliament. We're expecting at around midday. But for now, Amanda Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Now, the Bank of England has come under fire for spectacularly missing its 2% inflation target. Appearing before the Treasury Select Committee yesterday, the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, was asked why he had not foreseen the inflation crisis, why the bank predicted instead that price rises would be muted and transient. He insisted that the bank could not have foreseen this year's supply shocks. Let's have a listen.
You can't predict things like wars. I mean, that's as you, I think, were implying, that's not really in our power. I'm not sure it's anybody's power, really. It is well-established practice to accommodate supply shocks where they're expected to be transient, but then to not accommodate, obviously, the so-called second-round effects of those shocks. I would also say, before I move on to the labour market, which is important, that a sequence of shocks like this, which have really come one after another with no gaps between them, is almost unprecedented, I think.
Unprecedented. But is our inflation only due to those external factors? Could the bank have done more to stave it off? Well, former Trade Secretary Liam Fox thinks so, writing yesterday that, quote, "It is the duty of central banks to safeguard the value of our money. Yet the Bank of England has persistently undermined the inflationary threat and the problem of excess money supply. The Treasury Committee should launch a wide-ranging investigation as a matter of urgency." Well, I'm delighted to say that Dr. Liam Fox can join us now. Welcome to the programme. I suppose when it comes to the Bank of England, there's a worry that because it is independent, politicians should not be getting involved in criticising it. But you don't seem to subscribe to that view.
Well, it's not beyond criticism. The bank has a clear and paramount statutory duty of monetary stability. It is there to heed government policy, but it must always put that monetary stability at the top. I'm not sure that's been the case. And when we talk about global inflation, it's worth pointing out that while you've got inflation in the US of 8.3, in the Eurozone of 7.5, and the UK of 7 at the moment, and pretty much all rising. If you look at Japan, it's 1.2%. If you look at Switzerland, it's 2.5%. Now, if all this inflation was purely due to commodity shocks and supply shocks, it would be affecting all the global economies. An economy like Japan imports 100% of its fossil fuels, yet has inflation of 1.2%. So that suggests something else is going on. And I think that something else is excess money supply in some of these economies. If you look at what's happened with the purchasing of assets in QE across the pandemic in the US have added 114% to the balance sheet, the UK 100%, the EC, the Eurozone 88%, but Japan's only added 17%. Now, there seems to be a correlation between the increase in the purchase of assets, in other words, the supply of money into the economy, and the inflation that we have. And most people would say that's entirely it's entirely predictable and not something that's unexpected.
That is such an interesting point, because so often we talk about global inflation as if the whole world is just America, Britain and Europe. But there's so much more to the world. And I suppose that America, Britain and Europe have been following the same monetary policy, the same orthodoxy, well, really since the financial crisis. Is it wrong, therefore? Was quantitative easing wrong? Was it wrong to print so much money and potentially spend so much money during the pandemic as well? Has that been what has caused this crisis now?
Well, when you look at what's the point of purchasing assets such as government bonds, it's to increase the rate of growth, reduce the cost of borrowing, boost spending, prevent deflation. But clearly, if you do too much of it, then you cause inflation. That seems to be what we have in economies that have the biggest amounts of money into economies, the American, the Eurozone and Britain, the highest levels of consequence. And other countries, said like Japan, who followed the same set as policy, but at a much lower level, actually developed much lower levels. And the worry, of course, now is having come very late to the inflation party, as it were, Bank of England predicting transient, and 5%, constantly underestimating the rate of inflation in the UK economy. Dangerous now that they overreact quickly from quantitative easing to quantitative tightening to reduce the money in the economy, try to reduce inflation, but overcook the next recession.
I wonder if there is a time now to reconsider the independence of the Bank of England. Of course, up until 1997, it was politicians who set interest rates, politicians who were accountable to their electorates. And yes, that did mean that often there were some sort of electioneering moves, I suppose, when it came to the economy. That was criticised. The new Labour government came in 1997 and in its first week established independent monetary policy, an independent monetary policy committee within the Bank of England. Was that the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do?
The right thing to do. There's no problem with the independence of the Bank of England, where the Bank of England genuinely behave independently. It seems that in the pandemic, the Bank of England chose to maintain employment and businesses rather than monetary stability. Monetary stability is the day job.
I'm sorry, I missed that last bit of what you said there. Could you just repeat that?
No, I'm saying that, the primary statutory duty of the Bank of England is monetary stability. Monetary stability is the day job. That's what we're doing. So it's not a question whether the bank should be independent, especially whether the bank actually
Well, I think we're going to try and re-establish this line. We've got a couple of issues on the audio here, so stick with us, Liam Fox. We'll come back to you in just a couple of minutes. But for now, let's go and see what's happening in Canada, where the Prince of Wales and Duchess of Cornwall are travelling to today as part of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee Tour. Our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, is travelling to Canada with them for a tour and sent us a sneak preview of what we can expect.
The next generation of Canadians proudly waved their national flag, welcoming Charles and Camilla to their High Commission ahead of the royal tour. These are the children many fear who'll have to live with the consequences of climate change. The Prince of Wales believes we need to take better care of our planet, and his status as heir to the throne, Canada's High Commissioner to Britain believes, can champion change.
Prince Charles plays an important role in the world in catalyzing action around climate change. He can be very influential in getting governments and businesses focused and committed.
Parts of Canada's northwest are experiencing heavy flooding for a second year in a row, and Prince Charles and Camilla will hear firsthand how it's impacting Indigenous communities. The royal couple will travel more than 2,000 miles across the country, also spending time in Newfoundland and the country's capital, Ottawa. But Canada's past could come back to haunt them. Protesters toppled statues of Her Majesty the Queen and Queen Victoria last year over the discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children who were sent to residential schools in the 19th and 20th centuries. Meeting members of the Indigenous community will form a big part of the visit, perhaps with a view to avoid similar protests experienced by other members of the royal family on recent tours to the Caribbean. The Queen hasn't visited Canada since 2010. Problems with her movement means Charles is having to take on more of her workload. Richard Bethelson, who's helped organise past royal tours of Canada, suggests Charles should use this opportunity to connect with Canadians.
There is an ongoing kind of debate that's growing about the future of the monarchy as we do approach the end of this reign. People will be looking at Prince Charles and I think really assessing whether they can see him as the next King of Canada.
Prince Charles's great-grandfather, King George V, officially opened Canada House in London almost 100 years ago. It serves as a unique showcase for Canada's culture.
The royal couple's visit to the Canadian High Commission was about celebrating Canadians in Britain. This week's trip is about celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in a country that shares her crown. Cameron Walker, GB News, London.
And we'll be looking forward to seeing what's going on in Canada over the next couple of weeks. I'm afraid to say that we weren't able to re-establish Dr. Liam Fox's line, but I am delighted to say that we have the next best thing. Liam Halligan, the economics and business editor of GB News, is here in the studio. Thanks for joining us, Liam. We were talking about the independence of the Bank of England and the criticism that the governor of the Bank of England has come under. In your view, should the Bank of England have seen this inflation problem coming?
They certainly should have moved a lot earlier on rates. I've been writing that in my weekly Telegraph column for most of the last year. Throughout 2021, the Governor of the Bank of England, his counterpart at the US Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, they kept using this word transitory. They kept saying, don't worry about inflation, it's transitory, don't worry your heads about it. Why did they do that? Because they didn't want to upset financial markets. There's been a big fear since the global financial crisis that if you raise rates, then financial markets are going to take umbrage. What financial people call the taper tantrum, when you get rid of all the massive money printing, quantitative easing, and start doing quantitative tightening. When you start actually raising interest rates so ordinary people can earn a few quid on their savings, then financial markets will get upset. People like me were saying, but look closer at the financial markets. Look what the bond markets are signalling in terms of inflation. Look where food prices were back in the middle and the autumn of last year. Look where fuel and energy prices
There were those signals showing where it was going.
Even before the war in Ukraine, we already had inflation at a 30-year high. And as late as like November last year, the Governor of the Bank of England was still saying these inflationary pressures are transitory. They're not transitory, they're structural. And what that means is because the Bank of England hasn't raised interest rates very much so far, it's raised them 4 times in the last 4 meetings, but only to 1%, still very, very low. That means that now the big inflation is here and everyone can see it and everyone now believes people like me who've been warning about it for a year. You now have to raise interest rates further than you would have done and keep them there longer than you would have done to squeeze that inflation
Acting
out
later,
the
you
system.
have to go harder.
A stitch in time saves 9 if you don't make that stitch. And that, higher interest rates for a lot of businesses, for a lot of cash-strapped households, they do add up to economic pain. So the recession will be deeper than it otherwise would have been.
Oh, it's a dark situation. Well, I'm sure you'll be talking more about it at 1 p.m. on your show On the Money. We'll look forward to that. But for now, thanks for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Thanks, Liam. Now, moving on to our next story today, which is, of course, about the House of Lords. We're talking about how the House of Lords could be forced to move out of not only the Palace of Westminster, but out of London altogether, as the restoration and renewal programme is carried out in the Palace of Westminster. Now, in a letter to the Lords Speaker, Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove wrote that instead of the Lords remaining in the capital for the duration of that restoration work, quote, cities and towns across the United Kingdom would be pleased to extend their hospitality to peers. Now, it's been suggested that the Lords may decant to the Queen Elizabeth Centre across the road from Parliament, but Gove, whose department owns the building, has rejected that proposal. But is it wise to separate the Lords from the Commons? And should we return to a sort of travelling Parliament that we've seen in centuries past? Well, I'm delighted to be joined in the studio now by Lord Norton, an author, academic and Conservative peer, and of course, world-leading expert on constitutional affairs. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. There seems to be a lot of consternation within the Lords about this suggestion that you all might be sent off to various cities around the country. How would it work?
Well, it probably wouldn't. That's the problem. It's not so much the location per se, it's the very point you touched upon at the end of the introduction, which is separating the Lords and the Commons. So it's not so much a question of achievability. There are all sorts of enormous practical problems, but one of desirability. Is it desirable? And from a constitutional point of view, no, because you separate the two chambers, you strengthen government, the executive, at the expense of Parliament. Now, if we're going to move out, it means not just the Lords, but the Commons and government. You could make an intellectual case for a new capital, a Bonn or Brasilia, purpose-built for that, for delivering that. But we need to be together, because the Lords and Parliament is where Parliament is because of government, where government is. So you need to be together. And certainly for the two chambers to operate effectively in scrutinising and being fairly agile in challenging government, you need to be close to one another, separating the two chambers, rather like during the pandemic when we had lockdown, we had to meet virtually. Now, that was a success technically, but constitutionally was highly problematic because it made it very difficult for us to do a job effectively.
And I suppose so much of it, especially when the Commons and the Lords aren't agreeing as much as they might have previously done in decades past, so much of that is about the conversations and the interaction between individuals.
And indeed, the key word, those conversations, because it's not, if you like, the public clash between the houses, because technically we can communicate by message. It's the very point you made. It's actually between the formal stages, what happens informally, meeting members of one's own house, but meeting members of the other to discuss matters. And that's really the driving force. So you can meet, but just serendipitously meeting members of the chamber, highly informative information exchange, invaluable for knowing what's going on.
Is there anywhere else in the world where a bicameral legislature splits itself in two and has one upper house somewhere and a lower house somewhere else?
One out of all it's about 80 bicameral, because most systems are actually unicameral. But we've got bicameralism. Most follow the practice. You need to be together in order to do your job effectively as a legislature, as a parliament. And I think that's what we've got to focus on.
And I suppose the biggest example I can think of where elements of government are divided is South Africa, where you have the executive, the legislative and the judiciary in different cities. But even then, the legislature is all together in one place.
Yes, that's the key point, because you've got one or two cities where the location of the Senate and the House isn't coterminous, not next to one another. But you've got to develop means of communicating and communicating very quickly. No, that's the key point. It is the legislature that's the key point, the two houses.
Do you think this reveals just a sense of antagonism towards the House of Lords? Potentially, the government is using this as a bit of a populist stick with which to beat the Lords, and potentially this is teeing something up for making the Lords less important in the future.
Yes, is the short answer. And also to some extent, a failure to appreciate the constitutional significance of the legislature and how it operates and the need for two to be together. So the whole discourse, as you've touched upon, is in terms of my point about achievability, moving out, well, you'd be very welcome, well, we're very sociable. But that's not the point. I mean, there are practical points about, is it levelling up, bringing people closer to the people? Well, no, it's the opposite, unless you can find somewhere that's got the same transport links as London, which might be quite difficult. So there are all sorts of practical problems, but the discourse is in terms of that as I say, that achievability, the practical elements, not in terms of the constitutional
And of course, the Lords has been defeating the government quite a lot in recent times. This is not going to make it any easier to pass legislation in the upper house. Do you think this is a government who's given up on the Lords?
Not necessarily given up, but not understanding the Lords, which is not all that unusual for governments. They just know the Lords is there. They see us as, to some extent at times, an inconvenience, without realising what we're doing is revising. Most of what we do is improving the detail of the bill to the benefit of the statute book. And so the defeats on amendments, it's a minority of the amendments that are considered, because most are agreed without a vote, improving legislation. When we send it back, it's just saying, well, think again. And if you think again and insist, we don't normally then pursue the matter. So that's the way to look at it. We're trying to be helpful, just saying, well, look again, not we're being obstructive. But that's how the government tends to see it, because it doesn't fully understand the law.
Potentially the government will be looking again at its issue of moving out the Lords into other cities around the country. But for now, Lord Norton, thank you so much for talking us through that issue. It's such an interesting one for the briefing this morning. That's it for us. Coming up, it's To The Point. But first, there are some messages.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle, and a little bit of levity. That's the question? That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9